The first handful of dirt hitting her coffin sounded louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. Like thunder. Like something final. I stood there alone, my hands shaking, staring at the simple wooden box that held the only person who had ever truly seen me, while the rest of my family didn't even bother to show up. And that's when everything started to change. My name is Daniel. I'm 29 years old, and until that day, I believed I understood what family meant. I believed blood mattered. I believed loyalty was automatic. I was wrong. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, was an army nurse. At least, that's what she always said. But there were no medals in her house, no certificates framed on the wall, no stories about heroism. Just a quiet life in a tiny, aging home on the edge of town, where the paint peeled and the heater barely worked in winter. To my family, she was an embarrassment. They used to laugh about her. At Thanksgiving dinners, my uncle would joke, "Army nurse? Yeah, probably handing out Band-Aids in a parking lot." My cousin once said, if she was really important, she wouldn't be living like that, and my mother, she never defended her. Not once. She chose that life, she would say with a shrug. Some people just stay small. But I knew better. I had spent summers in that tiny house. I remembered how she would wake up before sunrise, make coffee, and sit quietly by the window like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. I remembered how she never complained. Not about the cold, not about the bills, not about the fact that her own children barely visited. She had this way of looking at you, like you mattered more than anything else in the world. And that's why, when she died, I was the only one there. No flowers from my family. No calls. No condolences. Just me, and a cold morning at Arlington. The ceremony was small, almost invisible. A flag folded neatly. A few quiet words, a life reduced to something so simple it almost felt wrong. I remember thinking, this is it? This is all she gets? I felt angry, not just at my family, but at the world. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, measured, commanding. I turned around and saw a man in full military uniform decorations covering his chest. His posture was perfect, his expression unreadable, a 4-star general. He walked straight toward me. For a second I thought he had the wrong person. But then he stopped right in front of me and saluted. Not casually, not politely. With respect, deep, unmistakable respect. "Are you Daniel Hale?" he asked. My throat went dry. "Yes, sir." He held my gaze for a moment, then said something that didn't make sense. "You need to get on a flight to Geneva." Immediately, I blinked. "I what?" "Your grandmother made arrangements," he continued. "Everything will be explained there." I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded insane. "My grandmother didn't even have money for a proper heater," I said. "I think you have the wrong person." His expression didn't change. "No," he said quietly. "We don't." That was the first red flag. The first crack in everything I thought I knew. Because in that moment, something felt off. Not strange. Important. I went home that night and stared at my phone for hours. I almost ignored it. Almost convinced myself it was some kind of mistake. But something inside me, something she had taught me, kept whispering, "Pay attention." So I got on the plane. Geneva didn't feel real. The clean streets. The quiet wealth. The kind of place where everything looked controlled. Not like the world I knew. I was picked up at the airport by a man in a black suit who didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. We stopped in front of a private bank. That's when my stomach dropped. Inside, I was led into a room where 3 people were waiting. Lawyers. Professionals. The kind of people who deal with serious money. They already knew my name. "Mr. Hale," one of them said, standing. "We've been expecting you." I sat down slowly, my heart pounding. I think there's been some mistake, I said. My grandmother. There is no mistake, she interrupted gently. Then she slid a folder across the table. I opened it. And that's when my entire world flipped upside down. It was a trust. In my grandmother's name. Total value, $12 million. I stared at the number, waiting for it to change. Waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a joke. But no one did. This trust, the lawyer explained, has been built and managed over decades. Investments, private allocations, and contributions. Contributions? I repeated. She nodded. From veterans. From families. From organizations. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Why? I asked. Why would anyone give her money? The room went quiet for a second. Then the man beside her spoke. Because she saved their lives, I frowned. She was a nurse, he met my eyes. She was more than that. They showed me the records, not public ones, not official medals, but names. 247 names. Soldiers. Veterans. People who had written letters, real letters, thanking her for things no one else knew. Pulling them out of impossible situations. Staying with them when everyone else left. Fighting for them when it didn't benefit her at all. She refused recognition, the lawyer said softly. She turned down honors. She declined compensation beyond what she needed. Then why this? I asked, gesturing at the documents. Because they insisted. I sat there, completely still, trying to process the truth. My grandmother, the woman my family mocked, had quietly built something bigger than any of them could understand. And then came the part that made everything even worse. The trust has conditions, the lawyer continued. Of course it did. I leaned forward slightly. What kind of conditions? She looked at me carefully. You are the primary beneficiary, she said, but distribution is based on discretion. Meaning, you decide how the funds are used. I felt the weight of that immediately. However, she added, there is a clause regarding family requests. I almost laughed. Of course there was. They can petition for funds, she said. But approval depends on whether their request aligns with your grandmother's values. And just like that, the tension snapped into place. Because I already knew what was coming. I flew back home 2 days later. And somehow, they already knew. My phone started ringing before I even left the airport. My mother, my uncle, my cousins. All the people who didn't show up to her funeral. Now suddenly, they cared. Daniel, we heard something about a trust. Is it true? You need to share that information with the family. By the time I got home, they were waiting. All of them, sitting in my apartment like they owned it. I stood in the doorway, exhausted, still trying to process everything, and there they were. Smiling. Like nothing had happened. My uncle stood up first. There he is, he said, like we were celebrating something. The man of the hour. I didn't move. You didn't come to her funeral, I said. The room went quiet for half a second. Then my cousin rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Daniel, don't start with that. My mother stepped forward. We're here now, she said softly. That's what matters. No, it wasn't. But I didn't argue. Because I wanted to see how far they would go. And they didn't disappoint. It started small. Questions, casual interest. Then suggestions. Then expectations. And finally, demands. We've been talking, my uncle said, leaning back like he already owned the outcome. Your cousin is getting married this summer. Big opportunity. Great venue, country club. I stared at him. And? He smiled. We think it would be appropriate for the trust to cover it. There it was. Not medical bills, not education, not anything meaningful. A country club wedding. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Clarity. Why? I asked. My cousin scoffed. Because we're family, I nodded slowly. And where were you when she needed family? That's when the masks started slipping. Don't do that, my mother snapped. She chose her life. We're talking about now. No. I said quietly. We're talking about her. The room got colder. You're being selfish, my uncle said. Selfish? I repeated. That money belongs to the family. I shook my head. No, I said. It doesn't. And that's when everything exploded. Voices raised, accusations thrown. They called me ungrateful, disloyal, manipulative. They said I was hoarding something that should be shared. But the truth was, they didn't understand what it actually was. This wasn't just money. It was discipline, sacrifice, integrity, everything they had mocked. And then I remembered something the lawyer had said. Distribution is based on discretion, so I made a decision. One they never saw coming. I invited them all to a meeting. Formal, structured, at the same law firm that handled the trust. They showed up dressed like they were about to win something, confident, entitled. I sat at the head of the table, calm, prepared. Before we discuss any requests, I said, there's something you need to see. I slid a stack of papers across the table. Letters, all of them. 247 stories. Real people, real lives. The room went quiet as they started reading. At first, they looked annoyed. Then, confused. Then, uncomfortable. One letter described how she stayed awake for 36 hours to keep a soldier alive. Another talked about how she used her own money to help a veteran rebuild his life. There were stories of sacrifice that none of them could laugh at. For the first time, they saw her. Really saw her. And then I spoke. This is what you're asking to spend, I said. Silence. My cousin shifted in her seat. It's just a wedding. No, I interrupted. It's not. I leaned forward slightly. It's the result of a lifetime of service you didn't even bother to respect. That was the breaking point. The truth, fully exposed. And then I made my move. I've made my decision, I said. They all leaned in. Hopeful, greedy. The trust will not fund the wedding. The room erupted. But I didn't stop. Instead, I continued. I've established a foundation in her name. That shut them up. A fund for veterans who don't have anyone fighting for them. I let that sink in. Every dollar will go towards something she would have believed in. My mother looked at me like she didn't recognize me. You're choosing strangers over your own family? I held her gaze. No, I said quietly. I'm choosing her. And that was it. The moment everything changed. They left that day angry, bitter, talking about legal action that never came. Because deep down, they knew they had already lost. Not the money, something bigger. Respect. And me? I went back to Arlington a week later. Same place, same silence. But it felt different. I stood there, looking at her name, and for the first time I didn't feel alone. Because now I knew the truth. She was never small. She was never forgotten. She just chose to be quiet, in a world that only listens to noise. And in the end, her silence spoke louder than all of them combined.